Hi everyone, my name is Frieder Klein. I'm a petrologist at Woodside Oceanographic Institution. The work I'm presenting today focuses on the formation of abiotic molecular hydrogen. I felt free to change the word because I realize there's also biogenic and thermogenic sources of hydrogen. So I'm going to talk about abiotic molecular hydrogen during the breakup of supercontinents along magma-poor passive margins, here exemplified by the Iberian margin that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, more familiar than I am probably. Before I start, I'd like to thank the seminar organizers for the kind invitation, acknowledge the contributions from my colleagues, Wolfgang Bach and Tom McCollum and others, as well as support through ODP and the successor IODP programs, NSF and HUI. I have my pointer. Oops, pointer options. Okay, so why would anyone care about the formation of abiotic hydrogen? First of all, I'd like to point out that here again, I'm talking about hydrogen that formed strictly by non-biological processes, thus excluding any thermogenic processes and biological processes. The formation of hydrogen is important as it leads to a net oxidation of the lithosphere. It facilitates the abiotic synthesis of organic compounds that is relevant to the origin of life, as some believe. And it supports microbial life with chemical energy that is independent of sunlight, such as methanogens, acetogens, sulfate reducers, and so on and so forth. Importantly, molecular hydrogen has been detected on other planetary bodies, such as in the plumes of Enceladus, where it may create habitable environments. So there's broad implications there. Lastly, the geological formation of hydrogen could be potentially of interest to an emerging hydrogen economy, and I'm sure Emmanuel and Eric will fill us in about this in more detail later today. The main geological sources of hydrogen on Earth include radiolysis, mechano-radical hydrogen formation during rock comminution, volcanic degassing at low pressures, and hydrothermal alteration of rocks. So in radiolysis, the decay of potassium, thorium, and uranium in minerals generates alpha, beta, and gamma radiation, which breaks apart the hydrogen-oxygen bonds of water and generates hydrogen radicals and hydroxyl radicals. And the subsequent reaction of two hydrogen radicals generates hydrogen, molecular hydrogen. The production of hydrogen via radiolysis requires relatively simple geochemical ingredients, water and radionuclides. Additionally, radiolysis proceeds at all temperatures and pressure conditions under which water is stable, even when it's ice, vapor, or bound in hydrated salts. Mechano-radical hydrogen formation involves the dissociation of covalent silicon-oxygen bond in silicate minerals by mechanical forces, which create surface radicals. Once these surface species are formed, they either recombine with each other or to form siloxane bonds, that's a silicon-oxygen-silicon bonds, or react with water, which releases hydrogen as a byproduct. Volcanic degassing is another source of geological hydrogen. Werner Giggenbach was probably one of the first people who recognized that the redox conditions and H2H2O ratios of fumaroles are governed by the SO2H2S equilibrium during degassing from the underlying magma. The reaction shown here is here in the yellow box becomes favorable at low pressures, which is why some volcanoes are important point sources of molecular hydrogen. One of the most important sources of geological hydrogen is the oxidation of ferrous to ferric iron by water during hydrothermal alteration of ultramafic rocks. Okay, if we turn to hydrogen formation during continental rifting along magma-poor passive margins, as illustrated in the upper panel, all four of these processes were likely at work. Radiolysis was likely most prominent in the felsic crust, as the mafic and ultramafic mafic crust and ultramafic mantle have low concentrations of uranium, thorium, and potassium. Extensive faulting may also have caused quite significant hydrogen formation, while volcanic degassing was probably more important along more magmatically robust stretches of the ocean continent transition zone. The process that was probably most important along the Iberian-Newfoundland margin in terms of hydrogen production that I will focus on in the remaining time was likely serpentinization, a process that my colleagues and I have studied over some time. Serpentinization is a widespread process along passive margins, but also slow and ultra-slow spreading mid-ocean ridges, subduction zones, and ophiolites, and even possibly other planetary bodies. In a nutshell, serpentinization is the alteration of a magnesium and iron-rich rock by water to form a type of rock that is chiefly composed of serpentine group minerals. That process turns a dry, dense, mechanically strong rock into one that is mechanically weak, strongly oxidized, and that contains more than 12% water. Here, molecular hydrogen is an abundant byproduct of serpentinization. Shown here are 3 images of 3 distinct hydrothermal systems, all of which are along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The basalt-hosted high-temperature TAG hydrothermal field, the hybrid basalt and serpentinite-hosted Logachev hydrothermal field, and the moderate temperature Lost City hydrothermal field. Remarkably, hydrothermal fluids vented from systems associated with serpentinizing peridotite show much higher concentrations of hydrogen and methane than their basalt-hosted counterparts. The question is, why is that? Shown here on the left is a diagram illustrating the magnetic susceptibility of variably serpentinized peridotite. As serpentinization decreases, the density as serpentinization proceeds, the density decreases due to the formation of hydrous minerals, while the magnetic susceptibility increases due to the formation of magnetite. This is nicely illustrated in this magnetization map of the rainbow hydrothermal field on the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, where we observe positive magnetic anomalies around upflow zones. However, some peridotites underwent complete serpentinization, but do not show an increase in the magnetic susceptibility. The question arises as to what controls the formation of magnetite during serpentinization. Okay, let's take a quick look at the underlying processes. By ignoring iron and and other elements for now, we can depict the major reactions in this simple ternary chemograph. In the system magnesium, silica, and water, peridotite is chiefly composed of the minerals olivine and orthopyroxene, here represented by their magnesium end members. When we add water to olivine, we go towards the H2O apex, and we eventually cross the tie line between serpentine here and brucite. And that's precisely what happens. We make serpentine and brucite, and that will be reaction 1 here. You can play the same games with pyroxene. You add water to pyroxene, and you cross the tie lines of serpentine and talc. However, if we want to understand the formation of hydrogen, we have to consider the role of iron, and shown here is a backscattered electron image of a partially serpentinized olivine with abundant dissolution pits. We also can see nicely euhedral magnetite, sheets of brucite, and the fuzzy-looking serpentine. Ferrous iron in olivine is oxidized by water to ferric iron and magnetite and serpentine, which reduces water and generates hydrogen, as here, shown here. However, brucite contains only ferrous iron, which means that the ferrous iron in brucite would limit hydrogen production. We can use theoretical models which are based on thermodynamics to assess how temperature affects ion distribution between secondary minerals and how that plays out for hydrogen production. The modeling approach is simple as that. We first calculate the equilibrium speciation of the reactant fluid, here seawater, then add a defined amount of solid reactant, that is peridotite, and let it equilibrate. Then we change temperature and see how it affects the composition of the fluids and the minerals. Shown here are the results of 2 modeling calculations for the reaction between olivine and water on the left and orthopyroxene and water on the right. The upper panels illustrate the predicted mineral assemblage as a function of temperature, and the lower panels show the iron content of brucite on the left and the iron content of serpentine on the right. During serpentinization of olivine, magnetite is just is predicted to form at temperatures higher than about 200 degrees C. At lower temperatures, more iron is sequestered into brucite, which limits the formation of magnetite. During serpentinization of OPX, magnetite is not predicted to form, which is because all the iron is sequestered into serpentine.
10 minutes.
Okay. Okay, let's take a look at the predicted hydrogen concentration as a function of temperature for serpentinization of different rock compositions and water to rock mass ratios. A couple of things become clear here. First, temperature, water to rock ratio, and rock composition directly affect the concentration, the predicted concentration of hydrogen. The production of hydrogen is highest around 300 degrees C. And hydrogen is formed at low temperatures despite the predicted lack of magnetite, which is due to the ferric ion component in serpentine. Let's turn now to actually seafloor serpentinites. We studied serpentinites from a range of geological settings, including the Iberian margin, Mid-Atlantic Ridge, Tyrrhenian Sea, Hess Deep, and the Mariana Fork. Illustrated here are two BSE images of serpentinites from the Mid-Atlantic Ridge on the left and the Iberian margin on the right. The one on the left shows abundant magnetite, whereas the one on the right doesn't. And when we submitted the paper for publication in Geology a few years back, one of the reviewers criticized that there was nothing to see in the right image, which is exactly the point that we're trying to make. There is no magnetite in that sample. Looking at the magnetic susceptibility and density relationships, we see that the samples from the completely serpentinized Iberian margin do not contain much magnetite at all, whereas those from the Mid-Atlantic Ridge contain lots. And based on our thermodynamic models, we hypothesized that the magnetite-rich ones formed at high temperatures, whereas the magnetite-poor ones formed at low temperatures. So we tested that using oxygen isotope thermometry. And just real quick, this is a bimodal distribution where we find the serpentinites from the Iberian margin formed at rather low temperatures, and the ones from the Mid-Atlantic ridges, or mid-ocean ridge settings formed at higher temperatures, consistent with the model prediction. So this is the last slide here. So at the Iberian Newfoundland margin, we estimate that the serpentinized peridotite makes up about 20,000 kilometers. So say the ocean-continent transition zone is 20 kilometers wide, which is a very crude approximation, and 1,000 kilometers long. That gives us 20,000 square kilometers of seafloor in the ocean-continent transition zone that is composed of serpentinized peridotite, which is a rather conservative estimate, but I would be happy to discuss that with you. This geophysical constraints suggest that the uppermost 2 kilometers of the OCT is strongly to completely serpentinized, with more limited serpentinization at greater depths, as illustrated here on the right in a study from Skelton et al. 2005. Considering that serpentinization chiefly took place at temperatures lower than 200 degrees C, where hydrogen yields are about 100 to 150 millimoles hydrogen per kilogram of peridotite, complete serpentinization of about 40,000 cubic kilometers, again, like assuming complete serpentinization of 2 kilometers depth, would release about 1 to 2 times 10 to the 16th mole of hydrogen. And if we assume that serpentinization only took 100,000 to 1,000,000 years, as Skelton suggested, that would suggest that there was a lot of hydrogen production during continental breakup, probably rivaling the hydrogen production at mid-ocean ridges during active rifting. In particular, also because there's lots of other magma-poor passive margins. Okay, yeah, that's about it. I'm going to leave my conclusion slide up here, and happy to take any questions if there's time. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Frieder. So does anybody have any questions? You can either type them in the chat, or you can come in, unmute yourselves, and ask directly. We have a couple of minutes. Gerardo has a question.
Yeah, I have a question. You do not talk about the inherent composition of the mantle that is different on rifted margins where you have subcontinental mantle. Yeah. Comparing to mid-ocean ridges. How do you think that this can change?
Yeah, so it definitely does change the general process of serpentinization. as there's more tends to be more calcium in there. So it's still a peridotite, and you have OPX, let's say 20-30% on average, which is in the end it's similar to what we find at mid-ocean ridges. There is definitely an effect of the protolith composition on serpentinization and the hydrogen production. I didn't have really time to talk about that in much detail. There's so much interesting stuff to talk about, but it would affect the formation of hydrogen, but also the pathways of serpentinization.
But
yeah.
Would you expect to have more hydrogen production because you have more or less iron, or what are the predictions? Because in your paper on Iberia, you did not talk about this, if I remember.
Right. Yeah. So if you do have more iron, you tend to have more hydrogen production. That is generally true. Though, because serpentinization at the Iberian margin, where you had less magma supply than at the mid-ocean ridges, so it's presumably cooler serpentinization, you have somewhat more iron or ferrous iron sequestered into brucite, which would then limit hydrogen formation, right? It's still, I mean, these values are incredibly high. There are differences, but there's probably more than enough hydrogen formed for any kinds of microorganisms.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So there are a couple of questions in the chat, but in the interest of time, Frieder, if you could please answer them in the chat, that would be really great. And we can move on to our second speaker.